This brings us to what I basically feel is a procedural anomaly in the way the annual Anniversary Day meeting is organised, in that you have this chairman giving a lecture and thus not under control. I hasten to reassure you that the printed version of the lecture, which, if delivered as printed, would run to a little over 2 hours, I'm going to give a version of it which is about a quarter or a fifth of the length. In some ways, it takes off from the anniversary address I delivered 2 years ago, which dealt with science and society. In that, although some of the discussion was general, in particular the discussion of how science advances, the changing nature of the landscape from early stages when many ideas contend to later stages where you have a fairly secure understanding, most of the focus in that lecture was on issues specific to the United Kingdom, and in particular a lot of it dwelt on protocols for handling science advice in policy making, drawing on UK examples and indicating some of the shadows that fall between the tidy principles and the messy real execution. The problem is that many of the problems that we face are problems which don't recognise the artificial boundaries between nation states that we have constructed. I mean, climate change, for example, by any definition, is a problem that recognises no boundaries. The emergence or re-emergence of new plagues, whether by our contact with ever denser aggregations of this, we move from 6 billion people to 9 billion people, we're going to end up 50 years from now with the population half as big again and fewer people in rural areas than there are today. Ever more crowded populations, often in ever more crowded contact with domestic animals, increasing contact with the internationalisation of what once was a small local bushmeat trade, other risks from xenotransplantation. In different ways, these have, in HIV and SARS, produced new plagues. One case we were lucky with SARS, unlucky with HIV. Those microbes don't carry passports. The problems of biological diversity are again problems, most of which need internationally coordinated efforts to address them. If you look at these problems from a somewhat different perspective, any dream of a more harmonious world surely requires a more equitable distribution of scientific skills and experience, no less than of wealth. The most scientifically advanced nations, of course, have a moral responsibility here, and part of it is simply direct aid to alleviate disasters in the developing world. That's one clear observation, one clear obligation. But capacity building so that developing countries can autonomously address or avoid or ameliorate their problems tomorrow is an even greater and even clearer responsibility. Ultimately, the security of tomorrow's world depends on wider embrace of the core values of science, of fact-based questioning and acknowledgement of uncertainty, the values made immanent in our enigmatic nullius in verba motto. And science has values for problem solving, and I think it has even larger, if less freely acknowledged, values as bringing the spirit of the Enlightenment. So what I'm going to do in this anniversary address is first give a very sketchy outline of some of the efforts that the world's academies have made and are making to coordinate their activities and bring themselves into a more cohesive unit. I'm going to illustrate some of those outcomes with brief reference in the subject of climate change, biological diversity and infectious diseases. And then I'm going to turn to say a bit more and enlarge on the theme of our obligations for building scientific and technological capacity in the developing world. depending on how the time goes, I will also say a little word about the larger and related question that we've been wrestling with this year and that looms ever larger, of codes of conduct and responsibilities for individual scientists. And then I'll end with a few words of housekeeping. The Royal Society can justly claim antiquity in its origins, but it was born of a time in which its creation seemed natural. And the academies in France, Italy, others followed. Those early times are hard to imagine from today's perspective. It was a day before really the rise of the nation state in the form we acknowledge it today. And when Humphrey Davy, before he was president but was the foreign secretary under Banks, he could and did travel freely for scientific exchanges in Paris in the midst of the Napoleonic Wars. It was an unimaginably different world. It was in some ways a better coordinated world, although travel was more difficult. The first steps toward more formal associations among academies date to 1897, when perhaps oddly, the Austrian Academy sought to form what it called, and probably had a different meaning then, a cartel of major academies. It has an interesting resonance right here locally with us in the British Academy, because it was the thoughts that some of these national academies were science and others were Wissenschaft, the whole range of arts and humanities, that prompted the Royal Society to ask, should it not enlarge itself to embrace the humanities? And the decision, which I personally have some regrets about, not having on the other hand participated in it, was to spin out and create the British Academy, which celebrated its centenary a couple of years ago. That early cartel was a victim of World War I. In 1917, the Royal Society initiated a review of it, and praiseworthily, I think, more reviews should do this, it brought an end to it, although, not surprisingly, out of the ashes, phoenix-like, 2 years later emerged the International Research Council, itself a victim of the time of troubles of the early 30s, and in 1931 the International Council of Scientific Unions emerged, a rather different kind of entity that conjoins professional associations with learned academies. Against that background, it was only about 15 years ago that, led by the US National Academy of Sciences, the Royal Society and others, there was formed, under various words, but eventually settling down to be called, the Inter-Academy Panel, which today brings together some 80 of the world's major academies. And more recently, that has spun out an executive arm, in a sense. I mean, following earlier conversations and consultations, including those at the First World Congress on Science, organised by UNESCO and the International Council of Scientific Unions in Budapest 5 years ago, an Inter-Academy Council was established. And it was formally set in motion a year later at an Inter-Academy Panel meeting on transition to sustainability in the year 2000. And the IAC, as I shall now refer to it, held its first meeting in Davos in January 2001 with senior officers from some 15 of the world's major national academies. My personal impression is that the IAP conferences and formal statements have been useful and influential, but I think the more formally staffed Inter-Academy Council, its more deliberate engagement with clients, holds the promise of a more focused engagement and influence on particular topics by the world's community of academies. And I'm hugely encouraged by its first recent report earlier this year on capacity building in the developing world, to which I will return later. More generally, I think the formation of the IAP and subsequently the Inter-Academy Council provides a mechanism whereby the world's academies can speak on behalf of science with an ecumenical voice on timely and important topics. And I'll now sketch for you, rather generously interpreted, 3 examples. First is climate change. Interesting, it turns out early reports on people having just seen the movie The Day After Tomorrow suggest that in the United States it's raised awareness and apprehension about climate change, whereas in Europe it tends on the whole to have diminished it. As people come out of seeing this totally over-the-top thing and being a bit more aware of what it's all about, sort of feel, well, crikey. But one thing is clear. Part of the problem with the still increasing inputs of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere is that they are not going to have a huge effect the day after tomorrow. And that's a problem because for these kind of non-linear and potentially disastrous processes that are unfolding on slow but deliberate, ineluctable timescales, and the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is characteristically a century, relatively small actions today are more important than very big actions later. And that's a problem because we and our institutions have no evolutionary history or experience with acting today on behalf of a distant future. There's another thing that's clear. Climate change is real. This is a millennium-based, somewhat more scattered, if you go back from the ice core data where the things are a little less precise. This is a millennium-long profile of average global temperature, and you see as you come to the middle of the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution really begins to take off. If you come to the year 2000, we're clearly off scale, and plausible projections tested against that background suggest a variety of scenarios varying in their impact depending on the kinds of actions we take. Of course, a clear scientific consensus on the facts and the remaining uncertainties has been greatly helped by the formation, again, of a global entity, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This body was set up in 1988 by the World Meteorological Association and the United Nations Environment Programme, and it involves scientists from 169 countries, including, of course, members from all the IAP academies, so that its scientific authority extends beyond the individual expertise and is not compromised by the political pressures of any one country or group of countries. It's a model for the future. There are and always will be, of course, questions about details. There will always be areas of uncertainty. But those who suggest that the marked changes in climate patterns we're seeing are not associated with human activities, as some still do, are similar, not the same people, but broadly the same motives, as those who suggest that cigarette smoking is not the major cause of lung cancer, and some still do. Recognising the doubts that are created by those who, for one reason or another, wish to continue business as usual, the Royal Society took the initiative a year or so ago in putting together a collection of the world's academies of science, including essentially all then on the Inter-Academy Council Executive Committee, to issue a statement in quick response when President Bush expressed his doubts about the reality of climate change. And we published that in Science, and I just quote that as one of the examples of the kind of fast response that carries, I think, added authority by its ecumenical embrace of the world's academies. Biological diversity. There's another topic whose discussion only really makes sense on an international basis. Now, we know amazingly little about the living things we share the world with. If you just start with the one basic question and just look at plants, animals and fungi and forget bacteria and viruses and ask how many distinct species have been named and recorded. Simple fact. I can't answer that question to within 10%. It's a number somewhere like between 1.5 and 1.6 million different species. But most of them, apart from the sort of furries and featheries, palm trees, a few sort of favoured emotionally resonant things, Most of them are still held in separate collections on different card catalogues, different places. There are problems with synonyms, the same species independently discovered, different places, and not yet sorted out. Not surprising, the most numerous single group of animals, as Haldane celebratedly remarked, are beetles, some roughly 400,000 beetle names. About 40% of those species are known from one collecting site only. Small wonder, the synonym problem. At present, we're adding about 13,000 new species to the catalogue of life each year, and at the same time we're removing about 3,000 as we resolve synonyms, a net addition of about 10,000. So if we don't know within 10% how many we've actually named, a simple factual question, we know tremendously less about how many different species of plants, animals and fungi may inhabit today's world. Plausible estimates range from 5 to 15 million. If I had to buy a ticket in the sweepstakes, I'd do 7 million, but you can defend estimates as low as 3 or as high as 100 million. And against that background, if we turn to ask about extinction rates, we know obviously even less. Anybody who gives you a number of species that they estimated went extinct obviously has not heard the facts I've just set out. If you don't know how many species there are, you surely don't know how many are going extinct. Does that mean we can't say anything? No. We can give a rather physics-like estimate by looking at comparative rates of extinction. If we take birds and mammals as typical, there's no reason to say they aren't, though they may be, and we look at the certified extinctions, and that's a conservative estimate of extinctions, in those better studied groups over the last century, and compare that extinction rate in those known groups, compare it with the average rate at which species went extinct, the average lifetime from origination to extinction of a species in the 600 million year sweep of the fossil record, you can say that the last century has seen an acceleration in extinction rates of a factor between 100 and 1,000 greater than the average in the background fossil record. And 4 different lines of argument suggest a further acceleration of a factor of general order 10 over the next century, and that kind of speeding up puts us squarely at the acceleration of extinction rates that characterized the 5 episodes of mass extinction in the fossil record, such as that which did in the dinosaurs. The difference, of course, is that those were associated with external environmental events. Ours is associated with our proliferation, increasing numbers, increasing pressure on resource. In the face of all this, we need the international community to know more and to know more faster, to be clever in using new methods, even though the rate-limiting process will always be the craft of collecting in the field. Not only do we need the knowledge, but we need the coordination of the action in less emotional ways to try to minimize the loss of the independent evolutionary history we are heirs to. So in that sense, following the 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development in Rio de Janeiro, in 2002, the 188 countries that are signatory to the Convention on Biological Diversity agreed measures to reduce the rate of biodiversity loss significantly by 2010. The only countries that stand out as exceptions to this, and have not yet signed it, are the rather eclectic collection of Andorra, Brunei, Iraq, Somalia, Timor-Leste, the Vatican and the USA. The UK in particular has been very active, particularly through the Darwin Initiative, in helping developing countries produce their biodiversity action plans and other conservation actions. This is a subject which obviously is close to my heart, but it's one which really does, more than many, require that we see the world as one place and coordinate our activities. It was another theme of the IAP meeting on sustainability in 2000. And I think, broadly, the most important initiative yet is the UN-sponsored Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, to which the Royal Society is an affiliated organisation with several influential participants, and its first global assessment of the world's ecosystems will be launched next spring, and the formal launch may actually well be at the Royal Society. I hope this will be a major step in helping us maximise the preservation of the planet's biological diversity, and amongst other things, that assessment will provide the basic information for policymakers that enables them, when making decisions, to do it in a more objective way that tries to take into account the value of the ecosystem services that are delivered to us and that are not conventionally counted in usual GDP. Infectious diseases. It's possible to give a very plausible, reasonable account of the sweep of human history since the dawn of the agricultural revolution about 10,000 years ago as being shaped by the emergence and spread of infectious diseases as agriculture enabled human aggregations large enough persistently to maintain infections such as measles or smallpox with high threshold population densities. A major factor in the Western world's takeover of the New World and Oceania was the viral and bacterial agents they unwittingly took with them. And people don't tend to ask, why wasn't there a reciprocal thing from the indigenous people there? And the answer is very simply, they were, or until recently had been, at lower population densities that would not maintain those kinds of infections. It's one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of asymmetric conflict. Not the first, on the other hand, to be attributed to the intervention of the deity. Today, with vaccination, antibiotics, other medical advances, and above all, not high-tech things, but simple applications of public health measures that are based on understanding the nature of infectious disease and its transmission, the globe is a healthier place than it's ever been before. And here's an interesting juxtaposition. The lower curve is mortality statistics from Liverpool 150 years ago. Half the children born were dead by the age of 5. The world today, with all its human tragedies in areas of conflict, last year 130 million children were born, 8 million died before the age of 5. It's still a disgraceful 8%, but it's nothing like the 50% of Liverpool 50 years ago. I mean, that is huge advance. But A, we could do better. The pharmaceutical industry is focused on the diseases of the rich, in Tom Lehrer's immortal phrase. That's why we're short of vaccines. That's not market forces, for all that they are our current religion, don't actually cure all problems. More importantly, there are threats, as I said earlier, of crowded circumstances, contacts with animals, the global travel, adding to HIV and AIDS, adding to SARS, producing perhaps H5N1 influenza that's person-to-person transmissible. Those worries are compounded with the threat of worries about terrorism, and all of these are agents which know no boundaries. So here is another area, as we underlined in our meeting on SARS, that was the first meeting this year, first discussion meeting, that require globalization and coordination. And I could, had I but whirled enough, and had you but whirled enough in time, go through a list of other things, of problems, some of them involving safety and health issues, some of them problems involving ethical issues, many of them involving both. In the written version of this speech, I've discussed water, stem cells, GM crops, and there are others coming that we don't yet see clearly. One of the things that can be said about GM crops, interestingly, is who is going to own the agenda for the uses we make of that technology in the second generation of products that ought to be serving the consumer, not agribusiness? And that brings me then to the question of capacity building in the developing world. We just take, for example, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger. Of course, there are economic, political, cultural, social science elements to that, but the physical and biological sciences and technologies will also be crucial, for example, in improving agricultural methods that are adapted to their environment, food preparation and distribution techniques and systems, and simply building up basic education about nutritional needs. Most developing countries, on the other hand, are currently not well equipped autonomously to harness the potential of science and technology to serve an agenda they set. There's a staggering gap in science and technology capabilities between the rich industrialised nations and the poorer developing countries. For example, on average, the developing countries spend about 0.6% of GDP on research and development, compared to the OECD average of 2.3%. Or to put it another way, the OECD countries have on average more than 2,000 R&D workers per million. Developing countries have less than a fifth of that. As I said at the beginning, earlier this year, the Inter-Academy Council published its first major report, and I think it really was a good and thoughtful and operational report. It delineated a strategy for building up capacity in science and technology across the world, and especially in developing countries, outlining potential activities and stressing that the assistance on offer to individual countries must be tailored to suit specific national circumstances and needs. Now, obviously, the need for such tailoring is clear. India and China are often included in catalogues of developing countries, but there are two countries that have, over the past decade, made such substantial investment in science and technology that they can no longer really be regarded as developing nations from the point of view that I'm using. They've got extensive infrastructure, substantial numbers of researchers working across all disciplines, and they play a full part in international discourse and activity. In contrast, within much of the continent of Africa, the building of scientific capacity really does seem urgently needed. And that's a responsibility on us. But it's not always clear that the UK has embraced this responsibility. The Royal Society in general, and I personally, greatly welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has identified as the two areas of priority and focus for the UK's conjoint presidency of the G8 and the European Council of Ministers: climate change and Africa. He's established a commission for Africa, which is expected to report in spring next year. But one glance at it and the plans that it's put for what it's going to do suggests that science and technology is not really at the heart of it. Only one of the commissioners has any background in science, and although it has a bleak reference to considering capacity building in science and technology, its outline plan really does not do as the Royal Society believes it should, which is make it a principal and overarching theme, crucial to achieving the other objectives. African nations need to be encouraged and supported to develop successive generations of scientists who can tackle the indigenous problems that they face. And that's got to begin in primary school, importantly both for girls and boys, laying the foundations of a good education in scientific thinking. It's got to continue through the training and development of young women and men in secondary school, in universities, and on into business and industry. Only in this way can these countries achieve populations who can recognise the benefits and the limitations of science and technologies, but even more importantly, who recognise scientific thinking, scientific reasoning, the core values of free and open questioning. So I have, as a sort of anniversary day present written to the Prime Minister, setting out these views and offering to put together a group of leading scientists from both the developed and developing worlds to help the Commission on Africa with its work over the coming months while it drafts its initial report, and beyond that when its implementation is to be realised. And I've further suggested that the new Chief Scientific Advisor that the Department of International Development is appointing, which is a very welcome appointment, and we've been very happy to be involved in that, that this person should play a significant part in the implementation of the Commission's report. And in my further helpful advice to the Prime Minister, I've stressed that the building of capacity in science and technology has to be a priority in any strategy for Africa and other parts of the developing world. At present, our government has no earmarked funds for capacity building in science. We are among the better countries in what we do for aid, but the best aid is the aid that will not need aid in the future. So I've therefore suggested on behalf of the Royal Society that during the next spending review, the government should make a substantial investment in this area through the Office of Science and Technology and in consultation with the Department for International Development. I would love to inflict on you my views on the larger question of the individual responsibilities of scientists. We've had a meeting recently that discussed that, chaired by the Foreign Secretary, Julia Higgins, and we concluded, as did a similar study of the US National Academy of Sciences, that if fears of terrorism stampede us into putting all manner of restrictions on the free exchange of scientific ideas, we will do more damage than anything we could prevent. Which is not to say there aren't some sensible precautions we could take. But codes of conduct go well beyond that particular fear of the moment. When people talk of codes of conduct, often you think of great exercises in fraud. This is the surface froth, and fraud in anything important is easily caught. The things that I think are worrying in a world of increasing pressures are things that may seem small but are ultimately consequential expressions of human frailty expressed every day in biased reviewing, unwillingness to consider a dissenting view, honorary authorship in the form of laboratory heads sort of putting their name on papers that they haven't read as a sort of droit de seigneur of our age. And I've commended in the written version that Peter Lawrence's splendid article in Nature on the politics of publication should be compulsory reading for all graduate students and their supervisors. We need to worry, as we talk about codes of conduct and things, of not tipping overboard and embracing the managerial culture that is rampant and runs the risk of creating within our still splendidly freely functioning scientific community a kind of audit society in which indicators of questionable merit are invested with specious accuracy and end up becoming an end in themselves. There are many of my colleagues who believe we ought to even have some kind of Hippocratic oath of the kind that medics used to have, but no longer. I think there's sense in making explicit the obligations of the profession, making them explicit whenever we talk of science, in secondary school, in university, but most particularly in the way we train the next generation of those who will carry the standard. My personal view is that that is a charge that is upon us, but a formalisation in some kind of formal code is neither necessary nor sufficient. An engaging document that when I gave to Julia Higgins she thought was a spoof is a compendium of such oaths for engineers from different institutions. And my favourite is one in which you pick up, as you swear this oath, a large chain and then swear an oath of archaic solemnity that is a kind of blend between Monty Python and Conan the Barbarian. It's easy to make fun of that. But the values to be expressed, which underpin everything I've been saying, are things which we really have to take even more seriously than we do. There is ultimately no substitute for effective mentorship, effective example. The exemplification of the canon is something that no oath can substitute for. A few words on the family in conclusion. Stephen Cox has already indicated some of the things we've done this year. I want to end on a couple of personal notes. First, we often remind ourselves that in the 1660s, the Fellows of the Royal Society invented the peer-reviewed journal. Philtrans is the longest-running scientific journal to have remained in continuous publication. We still publish a lot of widely respected journals, and amazingly, our global subscriptions actually rose in 2004, counter the general trend. One of the two notable retirements this year is John Taylor, who led the publishing section so well for many years. Another person I want to recognise in an anniversary address focused on global problems and global science is Ling Thompson. She is the person who led the international section, and there will be many inside and outside the Royal Society who find it hard to think of the international section without Ling. The Royal Society, interestingly, symbolically, had the position of Foreign Secretary 56 years before the UK government created such a post. Julia Higgins currently serves in this role, and thus among the 5 honorary officers has the primary responsibility for most of the activities I've been talking about here, and she does all of this along with a host of other things with seemingly effortless distinction and grace and above all good sense. I also want to acknowledge David Wallace, who not only gives us excellent service as Treasurer, but he manages in his spare time to be the Vice-Chancellor at Loughborough, which this year was listed in the Times survey as one of the top 10 in the UK, and as this year as President of the Institute of Physics. My personal suspicion is that he actually has several doppelgangers. And David Reed has just completed very happily his first year as Biological Secretary, sharing with the Physical Secretary, John Enderby, the crucial task of overseeing the annual election process, the annual election of the 44 new Fellows who are Commonwealth citizens or live and work in the Commonwealth. These are the people who ultimately exemplify the standards and aspirations of the Society, and the authority of everything we do rests on that. Each year, one of the 5 officers ends their 5-year term. I mean, it's a very elegant mathematical process, ensures continuity, but there's always a sense of loss within the family at Carlton House Terrace. John Enderby has served us exceptionally well, and I won't gild again the lily that was already presented to him by Stephen Cox. The only consolation is we can take pleasure in welcoming his very able successor, Martin Taylor, as I shall do in just a moment. In conclusion, I am hugely grateful to the many people, fellows, staff, a host of others, who work within the Society and more generally with it to serve the cause of science in the UK, in the Commonwealth, in the world. The Royal Society was born of the Enlightenment. Today, the core values of the Enlightenment, which we represent, free, open, unprejudiced, uninhibited questioning and inquiry, individual liberty, separation of church and state, These core values are under threat from resurgent fundamentalism in the West no less than in the East. Our forceful and effective presence on the national and the international stage has never been more important.
President, on behalf of the Fellowship and our guests, thank you for your address. From any objective perspective, it's very clear that many of the most pressing issues for the future of civil society are global in nature. And you've made it equally clear that devising appropriate responses to these challenges will require a collaborative, coordinated, and mutually supportive approach by the world scientific community. It should be gratifying to all of us to see the active role that the Royal Society is playing in the Inter-Academy Council and other bodies that are working toward that end. You emphasise, too, the special responsibility that we have as one of the world's wealthiest and scientifically most experienced nations to support our colleagues in much of the developing world, especially in Africa, as they struggle with the daunting and interrelated problems of poverty, water, energy, agriculture, health, and environmental management. All of these problems will require a scientifically informed approach if the challenges they present are to be met, and these problems are also of sufficient magnitude and importance that they require the attention of the global scientific community. The importance of helping these developing nations build their scientific capacity must be a priority, and a priority not just because it is the right thing to do, but also because it's plainly in our own self-interest. Our futures, as you have emphasised, are linked to theirs through the kinds of global interactions that you've outlined. President, thank you for your address, and thank you too for your leadership and stewardship of the Society through another highly successful year. Thank you.
Okay, agenda item 7, I just want to announce that the next year's anniversary day shall take place on Wednesday the 30th of November. The 30th of November is the magic date, and it just gets messed up if it's on the weekend. So next is Wednesday. And the agenda item 8, before I adjourn the meeting, I want, and I'll invite you to actually physically come up in a minute, I want to invite Professor Martin Taylor to join us on the platform. Martin is the incoming physical secretary. He is a person well known to the Society and much engaged in its affairs, and I won't time enough to embarrass him with fulsome comments. I use fulsome in the incorrect but current sense. Martin comes from what was UMIST, but is now part of the larger aggregation, the University of Manchester, a fascinating and ambitious project which has very sensibly turned to Australia for its Vice-Chancellor to do it, and therefore will probably work. Martin, I invite you to join us on the platform. Yeah, very good. Now you go and take John's seat. So, I now have to remember the mace that I sometimes forget. I should now like to bring this anniversary meeting for 30 November 2004, I'm reading my briefing notes very diligently, to a close, and I would ask that you all rise for the procession of the mace.